This Saturday, I arrived, and on Sunday I went straight up to the Blue Mountains and stayed in a, not a very difficult place to stay, a big, nice hotel, and walked out the next day along Great Chasm there and went to Echo Point, which of course is a very touristy spot, very, very beautiful touristy spot, in a way almost like an equivalent of Niagara Falls in Canada. And it was a nice day. It hadn't started raining. And all over the grass, there were new Australians, what we call new Canadians, new Australians, immigrants who become citizens. And they were picnicking in families all over the grass there. And you could smell all the different smells of all the different cuisines from around the world that they were bringing. And because I've seen this so often before in Canada, I immediately got the sense of it. What they were really doing was they were saying, well, here we are, we're Australian. We're Australian in all the complexity and wonder of this place, and we're trying to figure out how to be Australian in our own way, and yet in the Australian way. And one of the things to do is to go out in public and picnic and be seen to be Australian in a quintessentially Australian place. It's a statement of belonging, of being, to do that in public, in that way, in your own way. I find it, frankly, extremely moving when I see that. I think how sad it is that there are so many countries that belong to this theoretically the same civilization we belong to, which is to say the European Western civilization, that there are so many countries that don't understand how fabulous that is, how moving that is, how beautiful that is, how courageous that is. People who've chosen to come to a new country and to become part of that country, not to simply melt into it, but to consciously, in public, find ways of belonging and of being Australian or Canadian. And whenever I see that in a place like that, I think to myself, what an astonishing opportunity this is for, in this case Australia, to act differently from the other countries in the Westphalian, monolithic, Western, democratic tradition, to actually act with the complexity and originality that comes out of this kind of statement, this kind of intelligence of being open to complexity of people from all over the world and figuring out how all of those people are going to become part of, without simply in that old 18th, 17th, 18th, 19th, even 20th century European way of simply disappearing into the oneness of the place, but actually adding to the complexity and richness of the place. So I think there's an astonishing opportunity to, in fact, not reinforce the tired and failed Western models of the monolithic nation-state, but in fact to be more and more original in inventing, reinventing, enriching the complexity of the non-monolithic, different style nation-state. I say this with, I think, some confidence because I've been here enough, and I know that, in your history you got some things wrong. In our history we got some things wrong. We're still getting some things wrong. But that essentially you're on the right road, and we're more or less on the right road. And it's a different road, and it's an interesting road. So you're thinking to yourself, what the hell is he talking about? He's supposed to be talking about globalism. Well, I am. I'm talking about something really interesting, about internationalism, which is to say the possibility that people could consciously, because of course an immigrant is conscious, right? More conscious than those of us who are born in a place. We don't have to be conscious. We're just born here. We can get through life half asleep and still say we're Canadian or Australian. But if you decide to come to a place, you're conscious and you're courageous. You've already proved that by crossing from one place to another, no matter how poor you are or how in danger. So there's an astonishing new kind of both positive nationalism, sense of belonging and of community, and of internationalism, none of which has very much to do with the old-style patriotism, the old-style stuff, brought from England, brought from France, brought from Germany, brought from Italy, stuff which didn't work, which failed miserably. I mean, sure, they're interesting countries, but let us, many of us, I can't see you, but many of us came from those countries. And, let's not forget that the country that I came from is just coming out of a civil war in Northern Ireland, where I think 3,000 Britons have been killed by Britons within our lifetime. I mean, if there's students in this audience within your lifetime, 3,000 Britons killed by Britons in your lifetime. That's called a civil war, right? And, between 1914 and 1945, the Westphalian, I don't know if you know that term, it's one of those really boring, I think it's 16, does somebody know the date? 1648 or something like that. And it's a treaty which really creates the beginning of the idea of the monolithic nation state, which will lead to, between 1914 and 1945, the murder of about 100 million Europeans by other Europeans in a desperate attempt to create pure, beautiful little nation states in which there's only one race, one language, one mythology, one religion. Perfect little pink people or white people or whatever, praying the same prayers and reading the same books. Complete purity, so natural they only had to kill 100 million people in less than half a century, and that was only the latest attempt, right? This is not a success story. It's a great story for, production, and it's a great story in some ways for democracy, but it's not a great story for human relationships. Even if at the end of the day we've come out of it, if we belong to it, okay. The road was extremely expensive. And so what I'm sort of saying here is that there's an interesting opportunity if you're Australian or Canadian, because we know what that tradition is, but we also belong to another tradition, one which was here before any immigrants came, and is still here and still very much alive and has many philosophical bases to it, and one which has been created much more thanks to what is here than is admitted by most of the immigrants. An approach which is not monolithic, which is not singular, which is not Westphalian, which doesn't have one language, which has multiple myths. And that's kind of interesting to be conscious of. And you heard at the beginning Sandra Yates, making a reference to that. And you say, well, there's that reference to the traditional lands. Well, that's more than a reference to the traditional lands. That's a reference to the eternal sense of belonging in this place. And if those of us who are immigrants are lucky enough to belong within that mythology, that's an enormous privilege. That's something astonishing, no matter how many things were done wrong along the way. So, in spite of all of that, here we are. I don't know what we are, 1,200 people or something. Sophisticated, urban cappuccino drinkers. Yet, in spite of our urbanness, our belief that we are the people of the service economy, that we're post-industrial, that we're international in so many ways, unless we're talking about the Olympics or something like that, that we're truly international. We belong to this concept of the postmodern individual who no longer has to work in a mine. And then you sort of pause for a second and realize that the Australian economy is probably more dependent on commodities than it's been since the Second World War. And somebody'd have to tell me the exact numbers. I looked quickly and couldn't see them. I certainly know that Canada is more dependent on commodities than it's been for about 50 years. So it's kind of odd. There are all these people living in these, 5, 6 big cities, as if there were no mines out there, as if there were no commodities out there, as if we were somehow part of this new society where our fingernails are nice and white and we don't get dirty. And we only have muscles because we go to the gym. Right? And yet, take away the commodities from Australia or Canada, and I can tell you what's left is little better than probably a mid-level third world economy. Because I know ours is about a third dependent on the commodities. Yours might even be more. Take away a third of your economy, you're not going to be sitting in this beautiful hall. Well, not listening to a speech. Well, maybe listening to a radical local politician. Or a populist right-wing politician, one or the other, one of those extremes as in the 1930s. Anyway, so there is this contradiction between the way we're living our lives, which seems so European and Western, and the reality, which is that there's a whole other tradition here evoked by those new Australians. And everybody in this hall, unless you're Indigenous or partly Indigenous, everybody in this hall at some point was one of those new Australians, just as I was one of those new Canadians. And my family's been in Canada for a couple of hundred years, but every generation we marry an immigrant to keep ourselves fresh and energetic. And we try to marry refugees because that's even more fresh and energetic, and conscious and courageous, including me. I'm very lucky that way. So What's odd in all of this is that we haven't really come to terms with this contradiction between the way we're living in this, I love Sydney, and I'm going to Melbourne. I love Melbourne. I know I'm not allowed to say that here because I know you're in Toronto. You can't say that about Montreal and that sort of thing. But I love it. But we haven't, and you haven't really come to terms with these contradictions between the dependence on commodities, the sophistication of the urban life, and the reality that there is this other philosophical and cultural basis to your civilization, which was totally destroyed in Europe. There were attempts made to destroy it here, we all know that, and in Canada. But the interesting thing is, it didn't succeed. We didn't succeed. It's there. Whatever the problems, it's there, it's strong, and it's alive. And that means you're really lucky, because you have, in a sense, access to thoughts and ideas, which are deeply outside of what's taught in business schools, just to take a small example. Thank you for laughing. So what I guess I'm really saying is that I think that we've all bought into the Western concept of progress. I was reading this morning, I think it's a reasonably new Australian book by Michael Cathcart called The Water Dreamers. I don't know if any of you have read it. Very interesting. And he was quoting Philip, first governor, talking about the necessity of clearing away the woods, by which, of course, he meant clearing away stuff that isn't under rational, linear, utilitarian control, right, in order to create imitations of Europe. And then he quotes James Tucker, a convict novelist, who I haven't read, but I'm quite curious to read now, not necessarily because it would be good, but in which Tucker says that the British race must rescue, listen to these words, rescue the vast, untamed soils from the barbarism of nature. It's all there. Everything is there. Everything that's wrong is in that sentence. Everything that's wrong about your country and my country is there. Everything that's wrong with Europe is there. This sentence was written by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Right? If you go to a philosophy department at any university in Australia, what you'll hear is philosophy. This is the way philosophy works, right? What you'll hear is that there was Greece, and then there was Rome, and then there was Rome again, right? Because there's Rome without Christianity and Rome with Christianity, and then it sort of filters over to Germany and to France and to England, and then by the goodness of their hearts, it makes its way here and to Canada and to other lowly places. And for hundreds of years, we learn this stuff because, of course, we're not capable of having thoughts of our own. We haven't had a single thought of our own in the hundreds of years that people have been here. Not a single original thought. All we can do are footnote Immanuel Kant and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. That's all we can do. PhD after PhD. Specialists in Kant. Really. How interesting Jean-Jacques Rousseau is when thinking about the outback. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, great expert, really one of the founders of the concept of nature and therefore of how we deal with the environment today, right? There are 2 or 3 people like that, and they're all romantics. He has a nice lunch with his mistress in her lovely little chateau in the mountains, and then goes for a walk through the park where all the trees are lined up so he wasn't going to hit any of them. And he's got a glass in his hand and perhaps a cigar, and there are no bugs, no snakes, nothing, nothing dangerous. Somebody behind him to pick up the glass when it's empty, and so on. That's nature. And this is the philosophical basis upon which we are teaching philosophy, which would have any relationship to the environment in Australia or Canada or the United States or anywhere. And so, are you just at all surprised that we're not doing too well in this area? Because what we're teaching has no relationship to the reality as we know it, particularly in countries like this. So we've really bought in not simply to the romantic idea of what nature is, something that must be broken, tamed, and then put up again like pieces in a game, in order to sort of hide from us what we may actually be doing in holes in the ground, or whatever, with commodities. So we bought into all of that. We bought into the classic Western idea of progress, benefited very well. And we do have a lot of cappuccino and espresso machines. I mean, we have succeeded, in a way, in a way. And the growth has worked over a 200-year period. And yet, suddenly, here we are. We can see in the last 25, 30 years this growing environmental crisis, global warming, and you do a simple thing if you're a gambler. I don't know, Australians like to gamble a lot. I know my wife is part Australian, and so I've heard a lot about gambling in Australia. You're much better at it than the Canadians. I mean, although we do a lot of gambling, but we don't have as much fun at it as you do. Everybody knows in gambling that if it's a 50-50 risk, then you have a pretty good chance of winning, but you also have a pretty good chance of losing. Right? And so if somebody says to you, well, it's about 50-50 whether there's global warming or not, and they say, of course, if there is global warming and you don't act within the next 10 years, there's a 50-50 chance, another one, that, of course, your grandchildren will just die fried. Is that an acceptable risk? Right? Well, you know that's not an acceptable risk. Anybody who does the tote or whatever it's called knows that's not an acceptable risk. You bet on global warming and therefore do something about it. And yet here we are, unable to do anything. What is it about this incredibly sophisticated civilization with more university graduates, more university places, more PhDs than there have ever been, even imaginable in history? Even 30 years ago wasn't imaginable. And yet, faced by a very simple proposition, a 50-50 chance that your grandchildren are going to fry, we can't act. All we can do is negotiate decimal points. In international meeting after international meeting, you can try and blame various, economic sectors, but economic sectors only have that kind of power if the society has talked itself into impotence. And it's talked itself into impotence intellectually, through its education system, through the sophistication of its elite. This is usually called degeneracy, by the way. That's what that is. Degeneracy is highly sophisticated people who can't do anything. So if there's a 50-50 chance that your grandchildren are going to fry, that means and you don't do anything, that means you're degenerate. I mean, that's what they would say at Versailles in about 1750 anyway, and it turned out to be right there, so I think that's a pretty good example of the possibilities. So we can't move or act here, and I don't follow it on a daily basis. I know one of the major national crises, increasing crises here, is water. Will there be enough water? How much water is there? What's going to happen to the water? I know some things are being done. Not very much, I don't think. As far as I know, nothing very original or revolutionary which might change the direction of things. I could say in Canada, the big indicator of whether there's global warming or not is whether the glaciers are melting. You don't have too many glaciers here. And I've flown over pretty well all the glaciers in Canada. We got a lot of glaciers. We got a lot of north. And I've flown over them in little airplanes where you're just above the glaciers. And it's really simple glaciers. There's a bunch of mountains, and they're in a bowl in the mountains. And then there are valleys coming down, and so the ice comes down the valleys. And at the bottom of the valley is usually the Arctic Ocean, and it's like a tarantula or something, a spider, a big white spider, and the legs come down the valley, and at the bottom they break up like a chessboard. It's really fascinating to see, except the chessboard, each piece is, 5 stories high or something like that. I've been in ships where they're higher than the ships. Ocean-going ships. And then they fall over and they become icebergs, and then they float away and they go south and melt. And incidentally, the best tea water in the world is the ice from an iceberg, because it's thousands of year old ice and it's very, very intense. And people go out in the winter when they're frozen in the harbors in the Arctic and chip off enough with their snowmobiles and bring them back and keep it outside. And whenever you want really good tea for a visitor, you chip off some ice. And interestingly enough, the water, you don't drink too much of it, or you water it down. You water down the water because it's so intense. Anyway, a small detail. But the interesting thing is that photographs were taken between, say, 1945 and 1960 of all of these glaciers. I've seen these photographs. Every time you fly over one, they show you the photograph, and the photographs show the spider's leg coming down, and there it is turning into a chessboard at the bottom and then falling over into the ocean and becoming icebergs. And now you fly over, and all the legs come down, and they are short by anywhere between 50 meters to a kilometer. They've melted that far up. Now, of course, if you're sitting in Washington in a lobbyist group, that is not proof that there is global warming. That is not proof that the glaciers are melting. It's just they're a lot smaller than they were. And that's probably because they decided to become smaller for reasons that have nothing to do with anything that has to do with us, that's for sure. So what's interesting is, we can actually argue about something like this. I mean, if somebody as simple as me can look at a photograph and look at a glacier and say, oh, it melted. In 20 years, it melted by a kilometer. It's melting. Now, more sophisticated people would argue that, of course, but this is where you want the fool, because the fool can see it. Any fool could see that they're melting, but of course we aren't fools. We're sophisticated, silo-dwelling fools, backed into narrow parameters, locked inside these silos and these parameters, which prevent us from having what I would call integrated thought. And if you don't have integrated thought, you can't act. All you have is all sorts of bits and pieces of intelligence, lots of notes, lots of footnotes, no theory. And it prevents you from actually doing anything. In fact, it is a managerial dream in which nobody knows what's going on, and therefore each manager has a lot of power. It's just what's taught in most management schools, which is why they should be shut down. It's a nightmare for the rest of us, and probably a nightmare for the intelligent people or the imaginative people among the managers. So here we are, Australia, Canada, and some others, but I just picked the two that I really like and know, and I'm here, and I come from the other place. Here we are in this very special position. We depend on raw materials. It's a great weakness. It's a great strength. It is a relationship to the land which has been sort of deformed in a way, and yet I don't want to be entirely negative about it either. And somehow we have not managed yet to seriously look at ourselves in light of non-linear, non-rational, non-Western philosophies, in spite of the fact that the reality of the life that we lead ought to force us to have a look at that and to listen to what is being said by very interesting people who come from here and come from Canada. And really, if you look at these ideas, which I've tried to and I've listened and so on, is that they're essentially non-linear ideas. They're essentially spatial ideas. I mean, you know all of this. And it's extremely interesting in the context of overproduction, of a crisis in globalism, which is a child of the rational linear movement. It's very interesting to think, to imagine, that there's a whole other philosophy here which doesn't belong to the tradition that produced that problem. That is a philosophy which is spatial, truly spatial. That's why, the Europeans put on the Greek myths all the time, because they killed that in Europe. So they only have a kind of artificial link to the non-linear, to the spatial, by putting on things like the Greek plays and trying to imagine what it would be like to actually feel the spatial, as opposed to being the prisoner of the linear. I don't know if this makes any sense or not to you. To me, it makes a lot of sense. And it is such a privilege. I mean, I'm putting aside all the political stuff. It is such a privilege to be people of a country which has this kind of philosophy alive and well, because the people who are the source of that philosophy are alive and thinking that. Now, I know all the problems. I know all the politics and that sort of stuff. And I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something which is at the very heart of the reality of the place. And yet we've always rejected listening to those ideas. We've been so desperate to be European, so desperate to be colonial, even when we're puffing ourselves up about being better than them. It's always better than them in the context of them, as opposed to being interesting, because different, because complex, because spatial, because non-linear, because not monolithic. That's much more interesting. In fact, I would say that we've reached the point where the rational approach, and those of you who've read Voltaire's Bastards know I've been saying this for too long, that the rational has really, of course rationality has its role, but that it's reached a stage in Western democracies, style democracies, where it's out of balance, and it's in fact a negative balance, witness incapacity to act when faced by a real crisis, your grandchildren frying, right? Incapacity to act. And in that sense, the modernity of the West, the modernity of the rational movement, of the Enlightenment, of the Industrial Revolution, is so old-fashioned. It's so old hat. It's had its day. Of course, you can do things with it. You can improve it. You can amend it. There's great stuff in it. I love the paintings. I mean, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I like the architecture, right? It's fun. It doesn't fall down too much. And yet, it now seems to be so old-fashioned, so 19th century romantic ideological, while pretending to be modern. And you look at things like Dreamtime, or you look at First Nations philosophies in Canada, like Wetaskiwin, which is a Cree philosophy about the people living in the land, with the land, or another West Coast Canadian indigenous Tsawak philosophy, Hausit philosophy called Tsawak, which means all is one, which means that we are one with the place. And if you're one with the place, you can do something, you can act correctly within the place, as opposed to believing that the place is just a factory in the process of becoming. So in that sense, you could say that Dreamtime is actually postmodern, and that rationality is 19th and 18th century romantic. And that's, if you sort of think about that, it's kind of interesting. Even if you only believe half of what I'm saying, it's kind of interesting. So, in 1999, I was in Sydney in a university hall, about the same number of people, again being recorded for television or radio. And I'd just seen the head of your Reserve Bank, who was a conservative, and I'd been thinking about not whether I was for or against globalism or globalization, but whether it was working or not, which is a separate issue. And he said, off the record more or less, you know, this financial system, all of us, except for a couple of us, I mean, the couple were basically in Washington and London, think that this is a disaster, this financial system, and it's going to fall down. It's inflationary, it's unstable, it's unmanageable, we don't know what's going on, and so on. And so it made me decide, it was sort of the last piece in a puzzle, and I thought to myself, yeah, this is what's happening. Globalism is falling apart. It doesn't matter whether you're for or against. It's falling apart. It's coming to an end. And so that's what I said that night, with that kind of tickle in your stomach, and you think, gosh, I could be making a total fool of myself, and I will never rise again as a writer. Maybe I can do something else. I don't know, write romantic novels or something like that, but certainly not tough political stuff. And I say this with a little hesitation, because every time I say this in private, people who know me well say, for God's sake, John, you know, don't say stuff like that. It's so, you know, self-serving. You know, it's like you're going up there and saying, I told you so. And of course, given Protestant modesty, one should never say, I told you so. But on the other hand, I know a lot of people who aren't Protestants, and so I don't see any harm in it. On the other hand, there's also the problem of you know, the Catholic approach, which is, you know, you don't want to make people too aware of the guilt they ought to be feeling. And even if you reject both of the religious positions, why make enemies unnecessarily by being too smart in public? I mean, that would be an English argument, right? You don't want to be too smart by half or anything. I mean, there's that T.S. Eliot line that the humankind cannot bear very much reality. That kind of cynicism of that approach. Well, I think it's collapsed. I think it started collapsing after 1995. I've said that before. I think by 2000 we went into a post-globalist period, into a vacuum, as I think I've said. And I said that, you know, we had about 5 to 10 years to get it right, because otherwise events would take over, and the events would hit us so hard that we would then spend the next 25 years responding to the events. And that's, I told you so. You know, sorry. And that's where we are, deeply in debt in many cases. I mean, thanks to, you know, the two of us got a lot of commodities, so we can kind of fudge our way out of it to a great extent. But it's not because we're smart, it's just because there's stuff in the ground. There's a difference, right? And people say, well, what do you mean by globalism? You know, are you talking about neoconservatism? No, not entirely. I mean, are you talking about Bush and Thatcherism? Well, not entirely. Everybody bought into this theory. It really did become the ideology, the theory of a new era after the crisis of the 70s. It was the catchword. It was the new word for international. Couldn't say international anymore. You had to say globalization. And everything that was international was to be seen through the mechanisms of globalization, which is to say through an economic prism. Never been done before at an international level. There have been some little societies like Venice that ran a sort of economic dictatorship through the economic prism. And of course, Venice was an interesting thing for us because Venice is a place where at its height you could dance, you could sing, you could go to church, you could have lovely palaces and nice paintings. Crummy writing. Not much writing. Hard place for Penn International. Why no freedom of speech? Because it was an economically driven civilization. Now, some interesting messages there. Nothing wrong with economics. It just shouldn't be running society. It should be secondary or tertiary, and that's what most of history tells us. So here we've had this large financial crisis, and I don't incidentally think that the financial crisis has caused the end of globalism. That had already happened some years before. It's a little bit like the 1970s when there was the oil crisis, but of course it wasn't the oil crisis that caused the crisis that brought to an end Keynesianism. The oil crisis was just the thing that prompted the crisis that was coming anyway, and the financial crisis is just the thing, the easiest thing to prompt the larger crisis. And what you really need to do, what history tells you when there's a financial crisis, is you lance the boil. You lance the boil and you get the pus out. And history is full of examples. I wrote about it in Voltaire's Bastards. Going back to Greece, Sully in 1610 in France, you lance the boil, you get rid of the debt, and you move on with clarity in order to get new complexity. But if you hold up the unsustainable complexity of the debt, which cannot be dealt with, you're tying yourself down for decades and decades and preventing yourself from doing interesting things. And that misdiagnosis of the 70s led to globalism. Today, we're in very much a different mindset, but the same mindset. We want stability, and so we're busy protecting ideas which have failed. We cannot admit they failed, and so we have to do everything we can to keep them in place. Systems that have failed, we're spending hundreds of billions of dollars to keep them in place for fear that we'll upset ourselves by upsetting the leaders who failed. And we'll upset the professors of economics who failed. If we say it failed, what do we do about all those tenured professors of economics who control the economics departments in virtually everywhere in the world? I mean, 95% of the professors in economics departments around the world, particularly in the developed economies, believe exactly the same thing, with a few differences. What do we do? I mean, we can't fire them. We can't re-educate them. We're not Mao Zedong. We can't send them out to a pig farm, even though in that case it might be an interesting idea. We don't have to have them die on the pig farms. We just could get them out of the universities and let them think about other ways of doing things. And then they could come back and see how they'd learned, what they'd learned about reality. But here we are protecting this stuff. So, it's as if we've forgotten in this process, this managerially driven process of certainty that the past is behind us and we're doing new things. And if it's failed, well, we're going to do more new things. We're never going to look at the past. And so we forget what people have said for thousands of years about money. Thousands of years. They've always said the same thing. I mean, Hume talked about it as the oil which greases the wheels. In other words, it's the thing that makes other stuff move. That's all it is. It's not a thing itself. It's a facilitator. It's not actually a commodity of its own.